All right. Hmm. So one of the things I've always done is starting by kind of bringing up that there's this weird name we attach to this part called primitive accumulation. And as you read, this is something Marx took from Adam Smith, who sometimes it's called original accumulation, or sometimes it's called previous accumulation. And then to confuse everyone, Marx calls it primitive accumulation. But I recently I find this this phrase doesn't quite get at like what exactly we're reading about and the process we're actually, and I found it a frustrating concept. Just it doesn't really describe to me what we're getting at. And then last year, for the first time, I finally read this classic piece that Marx wrote called Value, Price, and Profit. As you can see, this was written in 1865, and it was right about when he was writing and finishing Capital. And he prepared these remarks for his, remember he mentioned it very humbly in I think the Working Day chapter, the First International, the International Working Men's Association, his little organization that he was trying to get off the ground. He prepared this this kind of was meant to be a short, condensed kind of theoretical talk on value, price, and profit, trying to kind of lay out a socialist account of these concepts and attacking the political economist and so forth. But as you can see, he says, and this is just in the middle of the narrative, we might ask, how does this strange phenomenon arise that we find on the market? A set of buyers possessed of land, machinery, raw material, and the means of subsistence, all of them, save land in its crude state, the products of labor. And on the other hand, a set of sellers who have nothing to sell except their laboring power, their working arms and brains. So that, I think, very clearly lays out the question of part 8 of Capital. How does it come to be historically that you have on one side this class that owns all the means of production? Setting aside, again, the land gets kind of complicated. We get into the landlord class, whatever. But, it controls all the tools, the machines. And then on the other side, you have a class, a much more large majority class of people who own nothing but their labor power. And this is kind of how I think is the big question of this part, how you come to that weird scenario. And where did I leave off? That the one set buys continually in order to make a profit, the capitalist, and enrich themselves, while the other set continually sells in order to earn their livelihood. So again, very clear. It's for the masses. He's trying to make it politically accessible, just laying it out. One class is trying to make money, the other class is just trying to survive, right? Real clear. The inquiry into this question would be an inquiry into what economists call previous or original accumulation, but which ought to be called original expropriation. And that, to me, I couldn't believe it when I read this. This is such a more clear description of what this process is. And I wish in Capital he would have called it original expropriation, because obviously what he's trying to explain is a society in which there's sort of very scattered mass production, people, peasants own land, artisans own tools, and you have this kind of very scattered system of production. And then how does all that land and all those tools, all of those things get separated from the mass of the people? What's the process that actually does that? And it's a process of expropriation, right? It's a process of actually taking the land and the tools and all the things from the masses of producers. We should find that this so-called original accumulation means nothing but a series of historical processes resulting in the decomposition of the original union existing between laboring man and the instruments of labor. So again, I think Marx is trying to really talk about something world historical, right? For most of human history, there was a kind of union between the producers and the land and the means of production to some extent. And there was forms of domination that extracted more surplus from those producers. But what really makes capitalism possible is you have to decompose this relation. You have to completely separate this mass of people from the means of production. And that is a history that has to take place. It's not just something that shows up automatically, right? And so calling it original expropriation seems to me a much better description of what we're talking about. We can move on now. And okay, so we have our normal series of chapters. To me, I think, again, I think he's kind of asking two key questions here about this original or primitive accumulation or original expropriation, which is, the first one is, where does all the original wealth come from that kind of gets this process going of MCM prime? Where does all the wealth come from? And he starts us off, again, you could say, remember last week when we're talking about accumulation, we're kind of looking at M prime and what happens with that. Is it accumulated or is it consumed? I think actually this part is going back to the original M and being like, where is all the wealth created that kind of kickstarts the MCM prime process in the first place, right? So, again, gives us a nice overview. We have seen how money is transformed into capital, how surplus value is made through capital, and how more capital is made from surplus value. The accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalist production presupposes the availability of considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of commodity producers. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn around in a never-ending circle, which we can only get out of by assuming in primitive or previous accumulation, which precedes capitalist accumulation, an accumulation which is not the result of capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. So something has to kind of accumulate a bunch of wealth to kickstart this MCM prime process. So that's the first question. Where does this original M and wealth come from that kickstarts this process? I think the second question is what he asks in that value, price, and profit, which is, how do these class relations emerge? How do you get a society with all of a sudden on one side are a class that owns the means of production, and on the other side a class that owns nothing but their labor power to sell? And here he again is quite sarcastically, bitingly critiquing the political economists who tell us how this class situation came about. Plays the same role in political economy as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell upon the human race. The origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote about the past. Long ago, there were two sorts of people, one diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other lazy rascals, spending their substance in riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how people came to be condemned to eat bread in the sweat of their brow, but the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Going on and on, he says, such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in the defense of property. So if you look at a world in which a very small minority own all the machines and all the means of production and all the capital, and the masses are poor and barely can eke out survival, one story you could tell yourself is that's just because the capitalist class is smart and innovative and frugal, and they kind of came up with all the right innovation to deserve all that capital, and the rest of these people are lazy, indulgent, and don't really deserve much more than what they have, right? So that's the kind of ideological defense of this class situation. Marx wants to tell us a different story, and his story says that both the original wealth and these class relations, that there's one answer to both these questions, and the answer is, he puts it on the next page, force, violence, coercion. And he says, in actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, In short, force plays the greatest part, both in getting all this wealth to begin with, but also in separating the masses from the land and the means of production, right? To create this sort of proletariat class. In the tender annals of political economy, the idyllic reigns from time immemorial. Right and labor were from the beginning of time the sole means of enrichment. This year, of course, always accepted. As a matter of fact, the methods of primitive accumulation are anything but idyllic. And so he goes on later to say this history of their expropriation is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire, right? So we're getting real dramatic. You know, this history is not one of good capitalists sort of scrimping and saving and accumulating and becoming the capitalist class we know and love. This is a story of blood and fire and force and robbery, right? And that's what actually creates the basis for the capitalist mode of production. By the way, this passage way down the line on page 918 kind of like, I think, sums up this whole part 8 really well, which is that the treasures captured outside of Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country, England or Europe, and were turned into capital there, right? So this, again, there's this story of violence and force and theft kind of creating all this wealth that flows into the mother country and then kickstarts this sort of process of capital accumulation that explodes in what we call the Industrial Revolution, or whatever you want to call it. So that's a pretty nice condensation of force, right? This is violence, force, which is doing this. And then the question then, I think, becomes a force as opposed to what? What else would cause this wealth to accumulate and or these class relations to emerge? And what I think is really important about part 8, as opposed to the rest of the book, like the rest of the book is trying to talk about kind of like these idealized fair market relations where you're supposedly in a free exchange and you're exchanging equals and you're kind of doing a fair contract between buyer and seller, and we're in the realm of the market, right? But in part 8, he wants to really focus not on those economic relations, but on, we leave to one side the purely economic driving forces behind the agricultural revolution. We deal only here with violent means, right? And so in part 8, he's actually looking at not, like in this case, he's actually talking about the expropriation of the agricultural population. You know, a lot of the peasants were expropriated because they just couldn't afford the land they were on, and they couldn't compete in the new emergent market. So they were forced economically by price signals and, you know, economic competition off the land. But in part 8, he really wants to focus not on those economic processes, but on what he calls later extra economic forces, like the state coming in and violently pushing people off the land, or the state passing laws like the enclosure laws that are actually making it illegal for people to share common land, and using like the power of the state or other forces in society to violently expropriate people or violently steal things or whatever. And so again, this is kind of going away from looking just at kind of the market economic relations, right? We're starting to look at extra economic force, violence, coercion, all this kind of stuff. So as opposed to what? So, but he's trying to say that this is, again, the prehistory of capitalism. It's got this history of violence and expropriation and robbery and enslavement. But then it kind of, once these class relations are cemented in society, you create a situation where force and violence becomes less necessary. So this is a little bit down the line, but he says, it is not enough that the conditions of labor are concentrated at one pole. Damn thing. Can't read. You know what it probably says, right? In the shape of capital, while the other pole is grouped masses of people who have nothing to sell but their labor power, nor is it enough that they are compelled to sell themselves voluntarily. The advance of capitalist production develops as a working class, which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. And I think anyone that kind of, if you try to organize capitalism and you try to talk to people about how capitalism's bad, you sort of learn very quickly that people kind of accept the overwhelming sort of economic relations as just that's nature, right? That's just how things are. It's just the way things are, right? The organization of the capitalist process of production, once it is fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population, hearkening back to part 7, keeps the law of supply and demand of labor and therefore wages within narrow limits which correspond to capital's valorization requirements. The silent compulsion of economic relations sets the seal of the domination of the capitalist over the worker. Direct extra economic force, which again, this is what part 8 is about. It's about this extra economic force. Still, of course, is used, but only in exceptional cases. In the ordinary run of things, the worker can be left to the natural laws of production. It is possible to rely on their dependence on capital, which springs from the conditions of production themselves and is guaranteed in perpetuity. It is otherwise during the historical genesis of capitalist production. The rising bourgeoisie needs the power of the state and uses it to regulate wages, to force them into the limits suitable for making a profit, to lengthen the working day, to keep the worker themselves at a normal level of dependence. This is the essential aspect of primitive accumulation. So again, the origins of capital need the state to come in and violently, through force, create the conditions for these capitalist class relations to finally emerge. And once they do emerge, you start to get this kind of self-reproducing system where it's, he doesn't use the word, but it's like hegemony can be like reproduced through just the economic relations themselves. By the way, there's so many translations of this. Here it's silent. In the international edition, it's called dull, which is my favorite, the dull compulsion. Here, this Danish guy, for whatever reason, called it mute compulsion. I don't even know which translation that's based off. But it's a way to understand that domination under capitalism, once it fully gets going, really is less about this kind of coercive force that you might see under feudalism or slavery, where you're like whipping and, you know, using violence to compel people to produce a surplus for you. That the domination is a form of silent, abstract, impersonal, market-based domination. But it, as Marx is saying, it takes a ton of history to get to the point where you can rely on these more silent forms of economic domination. And so part 8 is really trying to tell that history of how you need all this violence and coercion to get to a point where workers can be kept in line without all this violence and coercion, right? And for those, I mentioned hegemony, like this is also central to this guy, Antonio Gramsci's work, where he's trying to understand hegemony as a dialectic, if you will, between the need for coercion and violent repression from the state and what Gramsci calls the consent of the masses and the kind of ways in which people will just consent to their domination through kind of accepting things as self-evident natural laws of nature, right? And Gramsci says like certain historical conditions really require a lot of coercion, but capitalism's best when it can just rely on the sort of overall ideological consent of the masses, right? All right. So again, the force is really this history, this sort of origin of how capitalism gets going. Also, and it should be said more clearly that really, again, if we better call this not primitive accumulation, but original expropriation, this is just essentially a story of proletarianization, of separating the mass of the population from any secure means of living and livelihood. And he says that right in the first chapter. The process, therefore, which creates the capital relation can be none other than the process which divorces the worker from ownership of the conditions of their own labor. It is a process which operates two transformations whereby the social means of subsistence and production are turned into capital and the immediate producers are turned into wage laborers. So-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistory of capital and the mode of production corresponding to capital. Interestingly, a lot of people, I think, read this as like Marx saying this is something that happened in the past and now it's over, right? But there's been a lot of Marxist literature on this concept that tries to say like this prehistory is always ongoing, and there's always like new expropriations happening elsewhere around the world that are creating new conditions for proletarianization, and actually there's still somewhere around a billion people around the planet that still have some kind of subsistence connection to the land and to the soil, and there's been a slow and steady process of divorcing other billions of people over the last century from that relation, as we talked about last time, the kind of multiplication of the proletariat. So I think it's a big problem to just think this is Marx telling of history and it's all over, right? This is, and as I can't remember if I get to it next, but on the last page of the first chapter, he basically says, people, I'm also only looking at England, right? I'm looking at the classic form of capitalism as it developed in England, and it's going to happen in different ways in different contexts in different countries for the rest of time, right? Okay. Now, to me, this part is like the culmination of Marx's critique of political economy, because not only did he kind of lay out an account of like exchange and markets and value that shows that it's actually not really about as much freedom as it is about like relinquishing your social control over a system that dominates us, right? Not only did he show that this free exchange relation between capital and labor is actually based on exploitation and domination in the hidden voter production and extracting more value from the workers than they get back. But this part, of course, shows that even if Marx tried for the whole book to try to assume these kind of fair exchange relations, what underlies those fair exchange relations before we can even get to that point is a history of blood and fire and theft, right? And total thievery, right? And total robbery. And so any thought that this system is based on some kind of fair exchange relations is obliterated at this last point, where Marx says the whole origin of the system is based on theft and murder and violence, right? So this is kind of, I think, the real culmination of any semblance that you think like markets are about fairness and justice and fair exchange and freedom and all these sort of bourgeois ideals. And I think it's important that he says the basis of this whole process is the expropriation of the agricultural producer, the peasant, from the soil. It's the basis of the whole process. So I've been trying to argue that like Marx's theory of the proletariat is like really inherently ecological, because it's all, the basis of it is about separating the working class from nature, from ecology, and I think he says it pretty clearly here. This is the basis of the whole process. So after he does the theory chapter, which is chapter 26, the secret of primitive accumulation, after he does that, he goes to the next chapter, which he considers the basis of the whole process, which is the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land. So super important stuff. Oh, so here's the point as well, where he says the history of this expropriation assumes different aspects in different countries, right? And runs through in various phases in different orders of succession and at different historical epochs. Only in England, which we will therefore take as our example, has its classic form. So he's again putting sort of parameters on his analysis, although it's kind of interesting. He gets a lot into the Dutch example, French example in this chapter, so he doesn't even follow his own parameters. And this footnote's also really interesting, where he's like, yeah, by the way, capitalism kind of starts and fits and starts in Italy, and then it gets crushed, and then it sort of emerges again, and etc. So when capitalism collapses in Italy, what does everyone do? They go back to the land, right? Because that's the if you have everyone on the land producing their own food and stuff, you can't have capitalism. You just can't. So, all right, chapter 27. So there's a lot going on. I'm just going to cover some things quickly. You know, one thing I think people read this as almost functionalist, like, oh, so then people come to dispossess the people from the land so they can create a proletariat for the industrial bourgeois owners of capital in the cities, right? That's what's happening. It's not exactly that. It's more like people just start, again, plundering the land for their own private profit. And it, as a consequence, dispossesses the people from the land and forces them off of it and creates this kind of class of desperate propertyless laborers. And one of those processes is that it's not capitalists who are doing this, it's landlords and people who are privatizing and seizing land for themselves for their own private profit and or rent, wherever you want to call it. And they're turning that land into money for their own benefit. And that is expropriating people from the land. And then you have, again, he says, the old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. The new nobility was a child of its time, for which money was the power of all powers. So this new kind of landlord class is really into money. They want to see how can we generate as much money as possible. So they start just gobbling up as much land as possible. And, you know, a transformation of arable land into sheepwalks was therefore its slogan. So they want to, you know, turn a lot of land that might be cultivated small scale by peasants and just turn it into grazing sheepwalks. And we learned elsewhere about like deer forest and, you know, the deer preserves, I guess, for it's almost like maybe like hunting or like tourism or something, but they're just using the land to make money. Huge part of this, you know, people lament Marx never wrote his book on the state, but like the chapter on the working day, like the state is crucial in this part. It's the power of the state that creates this process. And in this case, it's the state that passes these enclosure acts that by law force the peasantry from the land, right? And again, this is what he means by extra economic force. It's power that's not the power of capitalists in the economy. It's this extra outside of the economic power that's needed to kind of force this process of expropriation. But again, I think the state's doing this on behalf of kind of the land class, like they're doing it not necessarily to create a proletariat, although maybe they were to some extent. And then we have, I think there was awareness on the part of the state and the elite at the time that we can't get people to work. No one wants to work if they all have land, right? If they have their own subsistence and land, they're not going to work, right? So this is from let's hear a defender of the enclosures, an opponent of Dr. Price. Nor is it a consequence that there must be depopulation because men are not seen wasting their labor in the open field. If by converting the little farmers into a body of men who must work for others, more labor is produced, it is an advantage which the nation, here's Marx in his little parenthetical digs, to which, of course, the peoples who have been converted do not belong, should wish for the produce being greater, which their joint laborers are employed on one farm. There will be a surplus for manufacturers, and by this means, manufacturers, one of the mines of the nation, will increase in proportion to the quantity of corn produced. So this bourgeois apologist of the enclosures is saying, listen, if these stupid little farmers are allowed to just cultivate their own little gardens, we're never going to produce wealth in our country, right? We're never going to combine labor and create like manufacturing and all this kind of division of labor that everyone recognizes is like important to producing wealth. So, you know, it's bloody and it's bad, but it has to happen. We have to get these lazy farmers off their little land, right? And so in that sense, I think there was this kind of awareness that they wanted to create a kind of proletariat. Okay, so then we get into chapter 28. Once you've expropriated the masses from the land, you create a class of people who are suddenly have no livelihood and are desperate. And with that comes what we now call vagabondage, people that are begging or using violence to try to survive, right? Because there's so much poverty. And if you read carefully, it's just horrific, like what these states like France and England would do to these vagabonds, to again trying to impose through state power, through force, trying to impose the discipline of wage labor onto the population. Because if people just hang out and they're vagabonding around, they're not working for capital and they're not increasing the wealth of the nation, right? And so this portion on 899, he kind of sums up the whole, he does a nice summary of what he's just covered. Thus, where the agricultural folk were forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. And that's the key here. You can't just have people loitering, hanging, and by the way, this is still what like urban governance in our country is, or even just governance in general is always sort of, trying to eliminate panhandling or begging or homeless encampments and things like this, and using the power of the state to force these people to not just be vagabonds, right? And that's a crucial part of like establishing a capitalist labor market is if people just want to hang out and sort of beg for food, that it kind of ruins the social order. So you have to use the power of the state to force that not to happen. And again, the state is just crucial, right? It's the state that passes these laws. The state passes laws that lower the wages to force them to have to work more and harder, right? So capital needs the state to get on its own 2 feet. It's kind of the takeaway from this portion. And he has a nice little part where he says, even the sort of revolutionary France, where, this, in many ways, the French Revolution was quite progressive economically. There was a lot of talk of like giving people a right to food and things like this. But during the very first storms of the revolution, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away from workers the right of association. So that they had just acquired. So in 1791, they declared that every combination by the workers was an assault on the liberty and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, punishable by a fine of 50 livres, together with deprivation of the rights of active citizens for 1 year. So again, there's this sort of tension between bourgeois rights of property and freedom and exchange, and what about the workers' right to organize? And the worry though is that if the workers organize and get too powerful, they will extract all the surplus that's needed to nourish capital, right? So we can't have that. Even when we're in a revolution, we need to clamp down on the working classes' rights of organizing. All right, moving right on. 29. How about the capitalist farmer, and how does the capitalist farmer emerge? And again, another just brilliant summary, I think, right after chapter 28, where he just summarizes things. Now that we have considered the forcible creation of a class of free and rightless proletarians, the bloody discipline that turned them into wage laborers, and the disgraceful proceedings of the state, which employed police methods to accelerate the accumulation of capital by increasing the degree of exploitation of labor, the question remains, where did the capitalist originally spring from? For the only class created directly by the expropriation of agricultural population is that of the great landed proprietors. So again, the expropriation creates a bunch of landlords, but they're happy to just sit and own the land and extract rent. So another class kind of comes on the scene. And I think what he lays out in this chapter is quite an interesting emergent class relations in the countryside that I think are important, where you get the landlord class that owns the land, and what they realize they can do is they can lease their land to what could be called capitalist tenant farmers. These are farmers that might have just been some of this recently dispossessed peasantry, and they want to keep farming. They own some tools. They own some machines for plowing. They might own a mule or whatever they use to plow the land. So they had some means of production. And they start renting out land from the landlords, and then even better, they start hiring wage workers. So you have like the classic capital relation going on. You got capital and wage labor, but it's on top of a landlord class that owns the actual land itself. And by the way, if you're interested, there's a very famous book by Ellen Meiksins Wood that basically says like this is how capitalism proper really starts. Because in this particular class relations, you get these capitalist tenant farmers that are starting to compete with one another, and the landlords are really squeezing them with their high rents. And through this competition between the capitalist tenant farmers, you get this relentless focus on developing the productive forces and improving labor productivity, which again, Marx says is kind of like relative surplus value. And Marx says is like the, what he calls the specifically capitalist mode of production. Like that's really what characterizes capitalism, is this relentless development of labor productivity and production. And Meiksins Wood argues that that really emerges with this particular type of agrarian class relations that you couldn't find anywhere else in Europe at the time, which were more sort of still quite feudal types of class relations. And so there you get the capitalist farmer, and the capitalist farmer starts, developing much more productive forms of production in the countryside, and that in itself starts to set free more and more people from the land itself, right? As you make the production more labor efficient, you actually, that leads to more expropriation of people from the land itself. And that's leads to what people have called like an agricultural revolution. In England in the 1600s, they really improved the productivity of the land in significant ways. And that meant you needed less people on the land. And so that set free a lot of people. But what that also did was once you set these people free, they are suddenly proletarianized, and now they rely on commodities for their survival. And so therefore they become consumers. They become a new market for all these things that are being produced in this society. So as they produce more food, they produce more manufacturers and textiles and other types of commodities that have a market now, because you have this whole population of people that doesn't just subsist for themselves. They now are just proletarians that have to buy the things they need, and they might buy some of the stuff being produced by this new kind of industrial capital. So he says, the events that transform the small peasants into wage laborers and their means of subsistence of labor into material elements of capital created at the same time a home market for capital. Formerly, the peasant family produced means of subsistence and raw materials which they themselves, for the most part, consumed. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large-scale farmer sells them and finds his market in the manufacturers. So the farmers find consumers in the actual manufacturing zones, and then the consumers of the manufacturers are the new, proletarianized consumers of the cities and things like this. So you start to see the creation of kind of like a mass consumption type of society, which is only possible when people are dispossessed of any means of livelihood and rely on commodities to survive. All right, so then the longest sort of chapter, which is like, okay, we talked about how the capitalist emerges in agriculture, but how does it emerge, and how does this sort of industrial capitalist come? And I think for this, Marx wants to tell a story of how all this capital got, again, stolen from other parts of the world or in other processes, and transferred to these core countries like England, where the amount of capital could then sort of flow into these big industrial investments that you would call factories or railways and all this kind of stuff. So I think we talked about it last time. Marx is keen on saying that before capitalism properly emerges, you have these, what he calls antediluvian forms of capital before the flood, these forms of capital that predate capitalism proper, and those are merchants' capital and usurers' capital. where it says, but the Middle Ages had handed down two distinct forms of capital, which ripened in the most varied economic formations of society, and which before the era of the capitalist mode of production nevertheless functioned as capital. These people are doing MCM prime, but they're not doing it by exploiting workers in the hidden abode. They're doing it through other ways, users' capital and merchants' capital. So merchants' capital is rooted in colonial violence and monopoly, and again, theft and plunder, and usurers' capital rooted in finance and debt, and particularly the use of the state to create money and create national debts that then become the platform for a whole financial class that can live off financial speculation, and which is another form of thievery, right? Like total, like like making money out of just betting and gambling, and because it's not it's very different than building a factory and exploiting your workers to create a surplus value, right? These are forms of theft, two different forms of theft that create all this wealth that then made the emergence of the industrial capitalist class possible. So he goes through a lot of this, and this is one of the most famous quotes. Again, we'll talk more about it, Gabe, but the people that say Marx didn't pay attention to slavery, he talks a lot, and doesn't just talk about slavery, he talks about the killing of the indigenous population, the discovery of gold and silver in America, extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of the continent, the beginnings of conquest and plunder of India, the conversion of Africa into the preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. And then he goes into some more stuff. The different moments of primitive accumulation can be assigned in particular to Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England, in more or less chronological order. By the way, those are kind of like the phases of colonial plundering as these European powers submitted it to, particularly not just what we now call the Americas, but also parts of Asia and so forth. These different moments are systematically combined together at the end of the 17th century in England. The combination embraces the colonies, the national debt, the modern tax system, and the system of protection. Systems of protection are like things that we now know, like the East India Company, like these state monopolies that were able to go and just like get all this stuff and make money off of it and bring it back. Again, the state is so central here. The state is making all this possible. These methods depend in part on brute force, yet again, instance of the colonial system, but they also employ power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, as in a hothouse, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. So that again is classic Marx historical materialism. He's saying we have these feudal mode, and we need something to come in and really hasten this transition, and it's the violent power of the state that really forces this process along, as in a hothouse. And then again, just that line I already showed you before, where like these states are then plundering these colonies for all sorts of wealth, and that wealth flows back to the mother country in the form of capital. And he says, like, these commodities, like the exclusive monopoly on the tea trade, as well as the Chinese trade in general, and the transport of goods to and from Europe, but the coasting trade round India and between the islands, as well as the internal trade of India, was a monopoly of the higher officials of the company. The monopolies of salt, opium, betel, and other commodities were inexhaustible mines of wealth, right? And I think last week we talked about like the triangular trade. Well, all that was just, you could see it as a form of plundering the lands and using slavery, which is a form of theft of people's actual like freedom, to just create all this wealth and all this money that flowed back to Europe, that created all this M that could then be channeled into MCM prime, right? And so this colonial period of, like, if you read about like the Haitian Revolution, like this was just this incredible sugar plantation just churning money for these owners that some of them didn't even live there. They were in France, and all this money flowing to France. It's quite wild. So, but he also talks about how the state creates financial systems that create debt in the form of the public debt, which then becomes this sort of free money that is created as capital that then all these sort of, as he says, middlemen in society sort of get to make money off of, right? So the middlemen between the government and the nation, and the tax farmers, merchants, and private manufacturers, for whom a good part of every national loan performs the service of capital fallen from heaven. Apart from all these people, the national debt has given rise to joint stock companies, to dealings in negotiable effects of all kinds, and to speculation. In a word, it's given rise to the stock exchange, gambling, and the modern bankocracy. And so the state creates these kind of the condition for financialization, as we call it today, and it creates a class of people that can make money off financial circuits. And again, they're just doing this kind of theft. Like anyone that's learned about like the financial crisis of 2008, what was it? It was a bunch of basically chicanery and fraud and theft. And that's kind of something that goes hand in hand with the emergence of capitalism and what he calls the modern bankocracy. But once again, you couldn't have that without a state that kind of starts issuing debt, starts printing money in considerable amounts, and the state kind of creates the whole possibility for this. But ultimately, these financial chicanery, these financial thieves create a lot of money and wealth that starts sloshing through society that can then be channeled into industrial capital. And it's very interesting. He also talks about how the state, they start to have to pay these debts back, so they have to tax the population. So they start to set out this sort of crazy bureaucratic sort of administrative thing of taxing the population. And taxing the population also becomes what he calls here an expropriating agent, because it's actually the failure of a little peasant farmer they suddenly can't pay their taxes, right? So they are foreclosed off the land because they can't afford taxes. And also the taxes make it harder for wage workers to make a living, so it forces them to work harder and longer hours. So it creates this more disciplined labor market because of taxes. In the next passage, I didn't put it here, but he says that like taxes play this role, and it makes some reactionaries think that actually the root of all evil in society are taxes themselves, even though it's capital, right? As Marx would show us. But, you can see why we get this kind of anti-tax kind of politics, because taxes play this kind of expropriating and disciplining role. And he does, again, Gabe, he goes deep into slavery and its role in creating all this wealth that flows to the mother country. At the same time, they're through an official cloak over British smuggling. Liverpool grew fat on the basis of the slave trade. This was the method of primitive accumulation. And again, I think we need to think about theft and violence in relation to slavery. That's what slavery is. It's about stealing people's lives and stealing people's lives to create wealth, right? And even to the present day, Liverpool quality has remained the Pindars of the slave trade. And this is sort of amazing. He says in 1730, Liverpool employed 15 ships in the slave trade. 1751, it was 53, 1760, 74, 1770, 96, and 1792, 132. So this steady march of increasing the slave trade is creating more and more wealth flowing to Liverpool, which then becomes one of the centers of the Industrial Revolution, right? So all that money stolen from the slaves and the lands of the slave trade, wealth stolen, goes to England, creates the basis for the Industrial Revolution. And then he says it quite clearly: while the cotton industry introduced child slavery into England, in the United States, it gave the impulse for the transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as pedestal. So that's a very clear statement of this kind of internal relationship between wage slavery and real slavery in different parts of the world. And then we end this section by saying, this is one of the most famous lines: capital comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. So to get capital off its feet, it takes a lot of blood and dirt and violence and theft and robbery and all this horrible stuff, right? So on that dark note, he then takes us to chapter 32, which tries to tell us how it doesn't have to be all evil and violent and horrible and miserable. But sometimes also Marx, as I said last week, like in the most important parts of the book, it sometimes feels like he's rushing things, because this is the statement of revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, and it's 3 pages, 4 pages. I would have loved if this chapter could be like 10 pages, maybe, just really flesh some of these things out. But there's a deeply, deeply logical argument he's trying to advance here, which is, and also historical argument. First, there are 2 kinds of private property he wants us to engage with here. The first is what I call private property 1, which is this scattered artisanal small producers and peasant proprietors that are scattered throughout the landscape. Again, this is kind of where before capitalism really gets going, this is kind of what the world of production looks like. It's that, if you remember, I call it the Adam Smith world of small producers and small traders sort of going to the market and all this kind of stuff. And he says this mode of production presupposes the fragmentation of holdings, right? Everything's scattered. The dispersal is very geographical, by the way. The dispersal of the other means of production, and it excludes the concentration of these means of production. And so it also excludes cooperation, division of labor, these things that we learned capital is really good at developing, right? And within each separate process of production, the social control and regulation of the forces of nature and the free development of the productive forces of society. It is compatible with a system of production and a society moving within narrow limits, which are of natural origin. To perpetuate it would, as Picard rightly says, to decree universal mediocrity. So a lot of us, particularly today, we kind of romanticize this kind of small scale, small producers, artisanal producers. Marx is saying if we just wanted to live like that kind of production system, it would just be mediocre. It would just, it wouldn't really create conditions for anything that really nice for everyone, right? So he says that at a certain stage of development, it brings into the world the material means of its own destruction, classic historical materialism. From that moment, new forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society, forces and passions which feel themselves to be fettered by that society. This word fetter is like a key phrase in Marx's articulation of historical materialism. He put it in his preface to the contribution of the critique of, where he's like, at a certain point, like the relations of production become a fetter on the development of the productive forces, the way they need to develop to create a new stage of production. And so in this case, this kind of small scale, scattered, fragmented form of production is a fetter on these new passions that want to kind of develop wealth at a larger scale, okay? So then he says very clearly, it has to be annihilated. This is sort of like, it's almost like a historical inevitability that this kind of small scale scatter will be annihilated. It is annihilated. Its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into socially concentrated means of production. The transformation, therefore, of the dwarf-like property of the many into the giant property of the few, the expropriation of the great mass of the people from the soil, from the means of subsistence, and from the instruments of labor. This terrible, to be clear, even though he says it's kind of necessary, it's also very terrible and arduously accomplished expropriation of the mass of people forms the prehistory of capital. That's what we just kind of covered. But we'll get to the second negation, but I wanted to keep track that he's talking about negations later in the chapter. And this is the first negation of, you have one form of private property, scattered, small scale, that is negated in the form of a different form of private property, which is like big capitalist private property and huge means of production and factories and industrial works, right? And what happens between, let's say, the 1400s and the 1800s is you're slow and steadily destroying, annihilating the scattered small-scale form of private property in favor of this more concentrated, giant, combined capitalist form of private property. So that's the first negation of one private property over another. Then he says, as soon as this metamorphosis has sufficiently decomposed the old society through its depth and breadth, as soon as the workers have been turned into proletarians and their means of labor into capital, as soon as the capitalist mode of production stands on its own feet, and that's kind of what part 8 is trying to tell us, the arduous story of capital trying to stand on its own 2 feet, the further socialization of labor and the further transformation of the soil and other means of production into socially exploited and therefore communal means of production. Again, this whole book is really trying to tell a story of how capital does that. It turns production into a more socialized and combined and even communal form of labor. But it's just owned and controlled by private capitalists. What is now to be expropriated is not the self-employed worker, but the capitalist who exploits a large number of workers. And actually, there's kind of another negation happening here, where the private capitalists, the big ones, are starting to expropriate each other by buying out each other. And this is, again, from chapter 25, the centralization of capital, where he says, the expropriation is accomplished through the action of the eminent laws of capitalist production itself through the centralization of capitals. Capitals are buying out each other, they're expropriating each other. One capitalist strikes down many others, hand in hand with the centralization or the expropriation of the many capitalists by the few. Other developments take place on an ever-increasing scale, such as the growth of the cooperative form of the labor process. The labor process gets more cooperative. The conscious technical application of science, the planned exploitation of the soil, the transformation of the means of labor into forms into which they can only be used in common. So again, making things more almost communistic, but under the rule of capitalists. The economizing on all means of production by their use as the means of production of combined socialized labor. The entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this, the growth of the international character of the capitalist regime, along with the constant decrease in the number of capitalist magnates. The capitalists get smaller and smaller, who usurp and monopolize all the advantages of this process of transformation. The mass misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation grows. This is kind of rehearsing the general law, perhaps, about how as capital accumulates, misery grows alongside it. But with this, there also grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of capitalist process of production. So capital actually brings millions of workers into these concentrated, socially combined, scientific, like complicated cooperative factories where they're producing all together and they're organized together, right? The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter. So now we have a new fetter. Now the fetter is these damn private capitalists that are sort of holding back us harnessing these systems for social betterment, right? Fetter upon the mode of production which had flourished alongside and under it, the centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. The integument is burst asunder, the knell of capitalist private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated. And that's the big bang right there. That's the big moment where he's basically arguing that, you know, as the capitalists expropriate each other, they get smaller and smaller. The working class gets bigger and bigger, it gets more organized, and its revolt over this horrible system grows and grows. And finally, the working class rises up and expropriates the capitalist and then ushers in something else, right? So that's the negation of negation, the replacement of capitalist private property with socialized property. And he says, capitalist mode of appropriation, which springs from the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property as founded on the labor of the proprietor, again, the peasants and the artisans. But capitalist production begets with the inexorability of a natural process its own negation. This is the negation of negation. It does not reestablish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era. People can still have stuff, you know. There's this funny Jacobin article that says socialism is not going to steal your Kenny Loggins records, right? Like this idea that socialism is the abolition of private property doesn't mean you don't get to have a nice bed or, you know, a nice house or some good music records, right? on the basis of it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievement of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. So he again says what capitalism does is it socializes production, brings people to create this kind of highly coordinated cooperative form of production. And on that basis, now the producers can actually take control of that thing and control it for their own social ends, right? Once they expropriate the expropriators. And it's going to be easy, right? It's just easy peasy to make this happen because the transformation of scattered private property resting on the personal labor of individuals themselves into capitalist private property is naturally an incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult process than the transformation of capitalist private property, which in fact already rest on the carrying on of production by society into social property. In the former case, it was a matter of the expropriation of the mass of the people by the usurpers. So part 8 is like this really long, it takes a while to get all the workers off the land and get everyone separated from the means of production, millions and millions and millions of people. In the former case, it was a matter of the expropriation of the mass of the people by the few usurpers. But in this case, we have the expropriation of the few usurpers by the mass of the people. So now we just need the masses to rise up and take what's theirs from this tiny minority of the ruling class, right? So, and I think it's really interesting that he footnotes right there the Communist Manifesto, because a lot of people like to say, oh, when Marx wrote Capital, he had really moved beyond the early Marx, and Marx was dumb in the 1840s, and he had all these bad ideas, and he finally became scientific and improved on all his ideas for Capital. But here he's like, just read the manifesto, just go back, because the manifesto says here that basically capitalism produces its own grave diggers, right? And that's a classic line. Capitalism produces this mass proletariat, and by producing this proletariat, it produces the seeds of its own destruction. So you could just, this expropriators are expropriated is just a restatement of the argument in the manifesto that the proletariat is this revolutionary class that capitalism actually creates. And so it creates the seeds of its own destruction. And you would think the book would end there, right? It feels like a good place to end the book, but no, for some reason we have chapter 33, which is to cover the modern theory of colonization. So what's this all about? First of all, he's dealing with this guy Wakefield, who's kind of like looking at colonies, whether it be the United States or Australia, and being like, these capitalists will export their capital to these places, and yet the capital does not grow or accumulate. What's the problem here? Wakefield discovers that in the colonies, property and money, means of subsistence, machines, and other means of production does not yet stamp a person as a capitalist if the essential complement of these things is missing, the wage laborer, the other person who is compelled to sell themselves of their own free will. Wakefield discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons, which is mediated by things. One of the classic lines of the 7 pages before the book ends, he defines capital as a social relation, right? So I think there's another point he defines the process of money begetting money of MCM prime, but here's the classic statement that capital is also a social relation, and unless you have the wage workers, you don't have capital, right? So the question is, why aren't the wage workers in the colonies? Where are they? What's going on? And he shows that we have again shown that the expropriation of the mass of the people from the soil forms the basis of the capitalist mode of production. But the essence of a free colony, on the contrary, consists in this, that the bulk of the soil is still public property, and every settler on it can therefore turn part of their private property into the individual means of production without preventing later settlers from performing the same operation. This is the secret of both the prosperity of the colonies and of their cancerous affliction, their resistance to the establishment of capital. Where land is very cheap and all men are free, where everyone has who so pleases can easily obtain a piece of land for themselves. Not only is labor very dear or expensive as respects of labor's share of produce, but the difficulty is to obtain combined labor at any price. So in the colonies, labor can just go off, be frontier people, and go off and find their own land, produce their own subsistence, do like a Little House on the Prairie type situation where they're just frontiers people, yeoman farmers producing their own subsistence. So therefore, they're not going to be wage workers. They're just going to go get the land and not bother with this treacherous labor market. But the capitalists who come there are like, where are the workers? We need to hire some workers, and they keep running off and developing their own land-based production. This stinks. So without this pool of workers ready at hand for capitalists, the law of supply and demand of labor collapses completely. On the one hand, the old world constantly throws in capital thirsting after exploitation and abstinence. On the other, the regular reproduction of the wage labor as a wage labor comes against the most mischievous obstacles, which are in part insuperable. And what becomes of the production of redundant wage labor is redundant, that is, proportion to the accumulation of capital. Today's wage labor is tomorrow's independent peasant or artisan working for himself. They vanish from, I meant to put the next part, but I didn't. They vanish. You know, if a factory says, oh, we just got a new machine, we can lay off some workers. Instead of them going into the reserve army where they become this kind of disciplining force for the labor market, they just go off, they move west, young person, to colonize the frontier, right? And so there's this, when you have free land, you can't have a functioning capitalist labor market. You just can't. And again, chapter 25 is trying to say that it's not just you need a labor market, you need the reserve army to regulate the labor market. So you need this pool of people who have no way to survive unless they get access to wages, right? And if they can just go off and colonize the land for themselves, capitalism won't work. It just can't work. And he kind of painstakingly goes through that. Wakefield and others are like, well, what the hell are we going to do about this? And they come up with a plan. Why don't we just make the land artificially expensive so that no worker can afford to get that land? And then they would have to work to even have an option of moving to the land. And so that would force. And then he says, eventually this becomes a moot point because he's really talking about the United States. The United States becomes basically this exit point for all these dispossessed peasants in Europe flooding across the Atlantic as immigrants, right? And suddenly you have all this immigration that creates these pools of propertyless proletarians that so create a surplus reserve army in these sort of, particularly the eastern cities, that this problem is kind of solved. But they were like, one option we could do is basically jack up the price of land so no one could afford to move off to the land, right? And then the book ends with this statement here. However, we are not concerned here with the condition of the colonies. The only thing that interests us is the secret discovered in the New World by the political economy of the Old World, and loudly proclaimed by it. The capitalist mode of production and accumulation, and therefore capitalist private property as well, have for their fundamental condition the annihilation of the private property which rests on the labor of the individual himself. So if the United States is, it's really based on this kind of petty bourgeois, like you move to the US and you can get your own land and you can develop like this frontier kind of Little House on the Prairie. Well, that's not going to work for capitalism. You got to expropriate those workers. And what's interesting is that eventually the United States did destroy, like, this Little House on the Prairie thing, not really a thing anymore. And it was, if you think, like, it took a while, right? If you think about, any of you have ever read The Grapes of Wrath, well, that is actually the story of the pushing off the land all these farmers that were trying to live this kind of frontier lifestyle in like Oklahoma, and they became Okies, right? That were migrating away to seek out wage labor in California, right? And that this process of really proletarianizing these small independent farmers and artisans in the United States took all the way into the 20th century, right? So so that's how the book ends, the expropriation of the worker. I would, could have put that as chapter 32 and then ended with chapter, but that's how it ends. And so we're done. Any questions?